1 month ago, I was in Williamsburg for an evening service at First Baptist Church. It was an interfaith community service held to remember the 9 victims of the June 17th shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, and the sanctuary was packed. Along with an extended series of prayers and a number of hymns in the Black church tradition, the service included a sermon by First Baptist Associate Minister Juanita Graham. Actually, I should say it was a sermon preached by the Reverend Graham, but it wasn't written by her. It was written by Martin Luther King Jr. a little over 50 years ago, and is known as his eulogy for the martyred children. Dr. King wrote it after a black church in Birmingham, Alabama was bombed by white supremacists, killing 4 girls, 11-year-old Denise McNair and 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson and Cynthia Wesley. Taking Dr. King's words, the Reverend Graham made a few changes so that they were just as applicable to the murders at Mother Emanuel. What was so chilling was how few changes she needed to make. Her concluding prayer was that we would not have any need for Dr. King's words in another 50 years' time. One part of Dr. King's eulogy, he speaking of the Birmingham 4, Reverend Graham speaking of the Charleston 9, is as follows. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life and the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their deaths say to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. And if there's any doubt that we are talking about a system here, consider that we're between the 1-year anniversaries of the deaths of Eric Garner in Staten Island and Michael Brown in Ferguson, that this spring similarly saw the deaths at the hands of police of Walter Scott in Charleston and Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and that in just the last couple of weeks, Sandra Bland in Texas and Kendra Chapman in Alabama both died while in police custody. And these are just the most well-known names. So here are Dr. King's words again. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life and the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their deaths say to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. There are a number of possible reactions to these words. One is denial. In spite of the generally growing awareness of systemic injustice over the last few years, not to mention blatantly racist individual acts, there are people, mostly white but not always, who simply deny that racism exists. Rather, they claim that everything was solved by the civil rights movement. I'm not going to address such denial this morning. I've done that before. Such people will come around with time and the help of friends, or their views are entrenched for other, usually political reasons. But in either case, Dr. King's words won't mean anything to them until they stop denying that racism exists. Another response may be harder to address. That response is to acknowledge that there is a real problem, but to express resignation that anything can really be done about it. It's just the way it is, they say. The system's too big for individuals to change it. The days of the civil rights movement are over, and there's nobody like Dr. King anymore. And anyway, it's not the system is actually broken. Rather, it's doing exactly what it was designed to do, going all the way back to Nat Turner's rebellion and the political strategy implemented by white elites that applied racism in service to classism. Or consider another aspect of this, namely gun violence, which is an obvious component of the murders at Mother Emanuel as well as other all too frequent mass killings, but is also the reason why, according to statistician Nate Silver, the chances of being murdered are 8 times higher for a black American than for a white American. Compare those odds to other countries, and if you're white, it's like living in Finland or Chile. But if you're black, it's like living in Myanmar or Rwanda. But if the mass murder of 20 first graders doesn't make any difference in how our society responds to gun violence, then what on earth ever will? I think that recognizing that there's a problem but feeling unable to do anything about it is the situation in which most of us find ourselves. And yes, most of us are privileged by being able, if we choose, to turn off the TV or log off the computer and go find something a lot more pleasant to do and think about. But there's a tension there, a pricking of our consciences, because I also think that if we had any idea of what to do, then we would, because we recognize our common humanity with every victim of violence and hatred, because we do know that we're all in this together. What then must we do about it? That's the question that Leo Tolstoy asked himself 130 years ago. He was almost 60 years old at the time and a famous novelist in his native Russia, best known for War and Peace and Anna Karenina. His books and other publications had only added to his wealth, though, since he was born into old Russian nobility and lived most of his life on the family estate. During his 40s, he experienced what we might call a midlife crisis and began to question his privileged place in society. Developing his own philosophy of nonviolence, for instance, Tolstoy came to influence a young Mohandas Gandhi, who in turn influenced Martin Luther King Jr. But it was in moving from the country to Moscow in 1881 that Tolstoy was struck in particular by the poverty that he found in the city. At first, he was simply curious about what he was seeing and tried to understand. Then, upon the suggestion of local friends, he visited Kitrov Market, where he saw more destitute people than he had ever encountered before. Dressed in tattered clothes, if not rags, hungry and desperate to find room in the Lyapin free night lodging house to survive the below-freezing temperatures of December in Moscow, Tolstoy couldn't help but feel ashamed when he returned to the warm, furnished, comfortable house where he was living. He remembered how, 30 years before, he'd attended a public execution where a man was decapitated with the guillotine. Tolstoy knew that that man was a dreadful criminal and arguably deserved his fate. But at that moment, Tolstoy knew that by his passive presence, he had not only shared in, but also approved of, a murder. And now, knowing of the hunger, cold, and degradation of so many people, while Tolstoy and others lived in luxury, he realized that he was similarly participating in a crime, only it wasn't a crime that was committed just once, but a crime that was committed over and over again. In spite of friends explaining that things had always been so and would and must always be so, it is an inevitable condition of civilization, Tolstoy resolved to do something to help the people he'd seen. He started a charity to help those in need, writing articles for publication to announce and explain his intent. He recruited his friends and other wealthy individuals to his cause, and though they all applauded his intentions, Tolstoy found it very hard to get them to commit to anything other than promising specific amounts of money that he had to suggest to them. I think he suspected from the start that his efforts were bound for failure, even suspecting that his own motives had more to do with demonstrating his own kindness and goodness. Still, in spite of his own conflicted feelings, he persevered. Tolstoy proposed that he could find the people who needed help by connecting with the census that was then about to be taken. So he joined the team assigned to do their work at Rezhanov House, which had a reputation for terrible poverty. Only he quickly realized something that from his privileged place he hadn't understood. The people he wanted to help were real people, with passions, temptations, and errors, and thoughts and questions just like his own. What was necessary then wasn't feeding and clothing people as one would feed and shelter sheep. What was needed was to do them some good. Moreover, he didn't really find any unfortunates, as he put it, who could be made fortunate by a mere gift of money. Rather, the needs that he expected to find were already being provided by others who were little better off than those whom they were helping, but were doing so, Tolstoy had to admit, in a better way than he could have done, short of devoting considerable time and care to each person. Before long then, Tolstoy realized that he wasn't really helping anybody. He did give out money to everyone who asked for it, at least until he had no more with him, and he suspected that doing so did more harm than good. He continued to go through the motions of what he had proposed to do, but he knew it to be pointless. Furthermore, of all the people who had promised to give him money for his charity, even promising sizable specific amounts, he received not a single ruble. Disgusted with his city friends, but perhaps most of all with himself, he left Moscow and went back to the country, where he spent considerable time trying to figure it all out. One particular understanding that Tolstoy reached is as follows. Everything in the lives of the fortunate is designed to keep them segregated from the unfortunate. From food, clothing, and housing to cleanliness and education, everything is constructed to keep those who have the means as far away as possible from the poor. He understood that there was no way that the fortunate could help the unfortunate while that separation existed. And in fact, that separation was built up by the same mechanisms that resulted in poverty. Recognizing, as a man of wealth, that he could hire people to work for him on his land or in his factories, and that in the interests of growing his wealth, it was natural to give them as little as possible while taking from them as much as possible. He finally reached the very simple conclusion that the cause of poverty is wealth. It is at this point that Tolstoy asks the question, what then must we do? Knowing full well that this was a question asked of John the Baptist, he also provides Luke's answer to the people's question. Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise. And though a Christian, Tolstoy notes that equivalent truths are to be found in Buddhism, Judaism, Taoism, and Greek philosophy. In general terms, he understood that every person, besides living for their own personal welfare, must necessarily serve the welfare of others. And he considered it a natural law that people, to say nothing of their reason or innate love of their fellow humans, are called upon by their very nature to serve others and to serve common human ends. Only in that occupation, Tolstoy concludes, does an individual obtain full satisfaction for the physical and spiritual demands of their nature. To feed, clothe, and take care of themselves and of those near to them satisfies their physical needs, while to do the same for others satisfies their spiritual needs. Now, there are, of course, big differences between late 19th century Russia and early 21st century United States. For one thing, we do have a number of public services that are intended, at least, to prevent the sort of abject poverty that Tolstoy witnessed. But if you've been part of one of our nights at Port, or one of our Friday evenings at St. Paul's, then you've seen the sort of poverty that does exist here and now. And when it's time to go home to your own comfortable houses, then I suspect that, like me, you've felt some of the shame that Tolstoy felt. What's more, there's an evident global component to this in today's world. For instance, Pope Francis recently issued an encyclical letter, Laudato Si', with the subtitle on care for our common home. Though primarily concerned with environmental exploitation and degradation, including global climate change, for which he places the blame squarely on human greed and short-sightedness, Francis is particularly concerned for the impacts on the world's poor. So akin to Tolstoy's natural law of humanity, the encyclical declares that wealthier nations are morally obliged to help poorer nations in responding to the effects of climate change. What we Unitarian Universalists call the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part is, after all, a system that connects everything. To quote from Laudato Si', when we speak of the environment, what we really mean is a relationship between nature and the society that lives in it. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it and thus in constant interaction with it. Recognizing the reasons of why a given area is polluted requires a study of the workings of society, its economy, its behavior patterns, and the ways it grasps reality. Given the scale of change, it is no longer possible to find a specific, discrete answer for each part of the problem. It is essential to seek comprehensive solutions which consider the interactions within natural systems themselves and with social systems. We are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. Laudato Si' was released on June 18th, which was when many of us first learned that the night before, a young white man had shot and killed 9 African Americans at Mother Emanuel. Into Dr. King's identification of a system, the way of life, and the philosophy which produced the murderer, we read Pope Francis' call for more than a series of urgent and partial responses to each part of the problem, because none of these parts of the problem are isolated from one another. We can't respond as if they were completely independent events to Thursday's shooting at 2 military centers in Chattanooga and Thursday night's shooting at a Louisiana movie theater, when they are part of there having been 204 mass shootings in the first 204 days of the year. Let me say that again. Friday was the 204th day of 2015, and in those 204 days, there had been 204 mass shootings. We cannot treat race and class and gender as if the forms of oppression and manifestations of privilege based upon them didn't thoroughly interconnect with and reinforce one another. And so we come back to the question, what then must we do? Tolstoy presents his answer to this question in 3 parts. First, be honest with ourselves about how far the paths of our lives might be from our own ideals, and have the courage to find out the truth. Second, reject belief in our own righteousness, that we deserve to be privileged based on our differences from others, but instead recognize our own accountability for how we use such privilege. And third, respond to the call of our humanity to serve the needs of both our own and other people's lives. I like these answers to the question because although Tolstoy arrived at them through consideration of poverty and his own role as a wealthy landowner in unknowingly maintaining that poverty, they are generally enough general enough to apply in other situations too. In everything that challenges our society, we are called to take ownership of how we live, to hold ourselves accountable for our actions, and to live and act in ways that serve not only ourselves, but humanity and our world too. But there is something else that is necessary in all this, to be able to do these things, and that is, as Dr. King says, to substitute courage for caution. It's natural to be cautious, to want to safeguard the comforts we've come to enjoy, and not merely physically, but intellectually. And it does take courage to recognize when we've fallen short of our own ideals, or when we're enjoying privileges we didn't earn, or when we're lifting up ourselves at the expense of other people or the environment. But the good news is that nobody is expected to be courageous all by themselves, that we are part of a community, this congregation, maybe others too, that supports and encourages us. Yes, Bree Newsome went up that flagpole alone, but as she herself is quick to explain, she was part of a whole team that made her ascent possible. So in the words of UU Minister Wayne Arneson, take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. But take courage, friends, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. May we always remember that it is so.